Is there an innovation opportunity in the buttoned-up world of legal contracting? You bet.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We are here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Innovation and change are everywhere. It's the universal condition. Nothing is static. Everything can be innovated. That includes legal contracting. Think about why you might be dissatisfied with contracts. There are lots of reasons. Fundamentally, they imply a lack of trust, or at least an artificial construct of trust. Let's write down how we are going to behave towards each other in the process of economic exchange, and then we can sue each other if there's a deviation. As a result of lack of trust, contracts can be nitpicky. Every little detail has to be contemplated, itemized, specified, and legalized. So contracts get fat with a lot of words, too many to read with true evaluation. Do you ever read every word in Apple's contract that you agree to in order to download a new iOS to your iPhone? Consequently, contracts become opaque. You don't know every word, so you don't understand every implication. So you can be blindsided by a surprise adversarial interpretation. B2B contracts between suppliers and customers can suffer from this problem just as much as your contract with Apple. Is this important? Well, contracting is all about private property and what you are free to do with it when exchanging with others and creating economic value. So in that regard, it's the most vital institution in the market economy. It pertains to trust, which is an essential ingredient for this vital institution of property. It pertains to the legal right and actual ability to do as one pleases with one's own assets. Freedom of contracting expresses the needs and ways of private economic activity. So yes, it's vitally important to free markets. But that doesn't mean it can't be a locus of innovation. And that's what we'll talk about today with one of the best thinkers in the field, Steve Phelan. Steve is director of the Michael A. Levin School of Management, Entrepreneurship, and Hospitality at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. He has a degree in psychology from the University of Melbourne, an MBA in marketing from Monash University, and a PhD in economics from La Trobe University. And he comes from the business world, including working at Telstra, Australia's Fortune 500 telecommunications company. So he knows all about contracting. Steve, welcome back to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thank you, Hunter. Great to be back.
Freedom of contract is one of the fundamental concepts of a free market society. And you've helped us in the past with the elements of it: trust, collaboration, specialization, the concept of supply chains, all kinds of direct and indirect consequences. In fact, Joseph Schumpeter called free contracting the foundational institution of civilization. But like any institution, it is dynamic and it changes over time. And you've observed that. You're an expert on contracts, both as an economist and a business consultant. And we've been talking about a recent Harvard Business Review article called A New Approach to Contracts. And so let's talk about that today and where contracting is going. So let's start with that Harvard Business Review article. What was the old approach that they're talking about, and what was wrong with it?
I think most listeners are familiar with the traditional, what the authors call transactional contract, where the lawyers sit down and draft up all of the points that you agree to and talk and try and anticipate potential conflicts as they do that and remedies for those conflicts should they arise. And so you can get these boilerplate contracts. Everyone has seen them, whether you're buying a car, a house, or any sort of business transaction that could run to dozens of pages, with every little detail of how something's going to be done or not done. And so the authors call that a traditional transactional contract. And there's an adversarial nature to that, I guess, that it's anticipating that there will be conflict, that it needs to be dealt with, rather than assuming that everything is going to go swimmingly. So that's sort of the point of departure for this article, to talk about, is there a better way or another way to do that?
Yeah, so they say that these traditional contracts, they're constraining, non-trusting, and potential barriers to collaboration, rather than institutions of creativity and innovation. Do you agree with their analysis, looking backwards historically? Is that true?
Yeah, I tend to agree that the traditional contracts tend to have that adversarial tone, and so tend to focus a lot on risks and downside and conflict, and what could go wrong, rather than how can we make things better, how can we make things go right. And so this often leaves little flexibility when conditions change in unexpected ways. And so this can lead to costly problems for the organizations involved. It could lead to, obviously, litigation is the first thing that people think about when a contract goes south. And there are alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that we've heard of as well, like mediation and arbitration. But there's also the cost of renegotiating contracts, of the turnover that it leads to, and having to maybe lose a supplier and lose a distributor, and the effects that have on your business when you have to go find somebody new all the time and bring them up to speed. And another thing that you see in the literature is this term called shading, which is the withdrawal of effort by one of the parties in the contract, where they figure this is not what we agreed to, but rather than blow up the contract, they just stop doing 100% effort on their end of the contract. And of course, that's a downside as well for someone who's expecting a certain result, that if they're not getting that performance from the other party. So I think problems can arise due to these transactional conflicts, obviously, and when you expect conflict. But as an economist, I tend to see alternatives to the traditional contracting in terms of a cost-benefit sort of analysis, a trade-off. So there are clearly costs to using a legalistic contract, but there's obviously benefits, which is why people use it. If there were no benefits, they wouldn't be using it. So what we're really talking about is decisions at the margin. When does it make sense not to use a contract? What are the alternatives? And I think that's where the authors are starting to open up this space in this discussion to talk about alternatives to this traditional adversarial contract.
Well, let's just stay in the problems for a little while, Steve, because I want to be sure that we get all of that out. They do talk about the negative incentives in those kinds of contracts. They talk about holdups, which you can explain. That's a technical term, but incomplete contracts, and that the parties make distorted investments that produce poor outcomes because of the negative incentives. They talk about using multiple suppliers as an example, because they don't trust one supplier, and that leads to more cost. And another element they point to is termination at the option of the original contractor. And if you put that in a short period of time, one of the suppliers said, hey, if you give me a 60-day termination notice, that's a 60-day contract. And I'm not going to invest anything in a 60-day contract that I can't get back in 60 days. So just talk about those distorted investments a little bit more.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the economics literature about these things, as you mentioned, like hold up and so forth. And it comes back to this notion of the fact that you can't plan for all contingencies with a contract. So try as they might, the lawyers are drafting these 100-page documents to try and figure out what the risks are. But conditions change, often in ways that you can't anticipate. And so when that happens, then there's an opportunity for an unscrupulous party to try and extract concessions from the other party. So because they know it's going to be costly for you to try and change the arrangement that you have in place. And so this is what hold up is, when somebody sort of wants to renegotiate the terms because there's been some opportunistic opening for them to get that discussion started. And it turns out the more specialized the relationship that you have between the parties, the more vulnerable you are, because you're putting more into this relationship, more specific investment they talk about in the economics literature. So obviously, if you can design a mechanism to adjust the contract in a fair way, then you're going to reduce these costs of hold up, of being held up by the other party who tries to renegotiate the agreement. But as you point out, there are also costs in defending yourself against holdup. So one way I can not be vulnerable to somebody trying to renegotiate is to have multiple suppliers, right? So if somebody tries to give me a hard time, I'll just switch more business to the other supplier and so forth. But as a result, I can't develop a very specialized, close relationship with my suppliers because they're always worried that I'm just going to switch whenever I'm not happy. And there's plenty of examples of this in the business world where that's happened, where you thought you had this special relationship, and a new management comes in, and then they dump you and go with somebody else who's a lower cost or something with no warning. And so suppliers, I think, are justified in being worried about whether these deals are going to be upheld. Other examples I can think of, defense contractors, for example, are notorious for lowballing bids and then making profit through change orders. So I actually had a neighbor when I used to live in Dallas who was working for a military party, and he complained constantly about how the contractor was not giving the best efforts that they promised in the contract. He was always saying, well, the contract says they have to give their best efforts. But, very few buyers on $1 billion contract get down to specifying the size of the screws to be used, right? So if the contractor decides to use 3-inch screws instead of 6-inch screws and makes the whole thing unsafe and rickety, then they can point out it wasn't in the contract and they're making their best efforts. And if you want the 6-inch screws, then they want a change order, right? And they want a higher price. So anyone who's been around business and contracting for long enough knows that those things happen quite a bit, right? And so you repeat that process many times and you start to get some serious cost overruns that you didn't anticipate. So the buyer's alternative might be to sue, right? But, this is going to cost you a lot of money to go to court to try and prove whether they were using best efforts or not.
Yeah, and part of that, I presume then, Steve, is the complexity of the present day. As you say, it's a lot of complexity to get down to the length of the screws in the contract, and that's going to take a lot of pages and a lot of language and a lot of lawyers, and maybe it's not possible to get down to that level of detail ultimately.
Right, and lawyers aren't experts on screws, right? And whether you need 3-inch or 6-inch screws, so now you need an engineering consultant to come in and tell you what to write in the contract, and all of that costs money as well, right? And even having the lawyers sitting around for weeks drafting a contract is costing you money. So, and economists recognize it's impossible to come up with what they call a complete contract that considers every possible contingency. And so that gives this opportunity for holdup.
Well, let's then pivot to the new approach. I want to go through something that you told us in a previous podcast, Steve. It was episode 56, and you talked about two kinds of risks in contracting. One was relational risk, and one was performance risk. So just differentiate those for us, and then we'll get into this new form of contracting, which I think makes a difference between those two risks.
Right. So typically when we look at performance, we think about performance risk. Right? Does the party have the ability to get the job done, the competence to carry out the task that they've been assigned? But there's also a second part of that, which is the relational risk, which is their level of motivation to fulfill their end of the bargain, right? So you can think of that as on a continuum from giving that less than optimal effort that we talked about, all the way through to no effort at all, to actively stealing your trade secrets or your customers or something like that. So it's not just a matter of having no effort. It can even be worse than that, where they're actually stealing things like trade secrets that are very valuable to your company. So we're very concerned then about how do we measure performance, but also how do we get people that have got the right incentives to perform, even if they're capable of it. So this ability to measure performance, it turns out, varies by the type of contract. So some work is easy to measure performance, and so you tend to have piecework type contracts. I'll pay you per garment that you produce, or garments that don't have defects or something like that. Picking strawberries, I'll pay you by the punnet of strawberries. So I can measure that pretty easily. But other things are more difficult to measure. So we've talked about $1 billion defense contract. I mean, the incredible amount of complexity and all the moving parts in that, to actually know all of these subcontractors doing what they're meant to be doing, that's a problem. We have the same issue at the university on evaluating professors because they have multiple parts to their job. They have teaching, they have research, they have service to the institution. So it's very difficult to measure how much effort somebody's putting in as a professor on a day-to-day basis, right? And so this is why we tend to have what's known as a results-oriented work environment at the university, where you bring in someone as an assistant professor on probation for 5 to 6 years, and you basically give them a bar and say, you have to get over this bar on your teaching evaluations, on your research output, on your service level. And if you don't clear the bar, you're no longer employed here. So this is the famous tenure decision that you hear about. And so literally it just means that new professors are on probation and we can't measure their effort day to day. So I often joke, you could be out on the golf course every day for those 5 years if you like, but if you meet those metrics of the bar that's set for you at your institution, then fine. You might work all night and all weekend for all we know. Who are we to judge? But definitely, if you don't hit the bar, then there's no place for you.
So maybe that's an example of this new approach, Steve. The authors of the article we're talking about refer to it as a formal relational contract. That's the new idea in contracting. Formal means it's written down, so you've got legal words and so on, which presumably can be litigated. But relational means that it refers to some of those non-quantifiable, qualitative kinds of elements that you just talked about. So dig into this idea of a formal relational contract and whether you think it's new and promising in the world of contracting.
Yeah, so what's interesting on this article and where they go with this is I think that everyone recognizes we've always had informal relations in business and the famous handshake agreements that you hear about, and that people have developed an understanding and over time of people they can deal with, that they can trust, people who have integrity and so forth. And once they recognize those characteristics, they don't need to have it written down. Here, what they're saying is that maybe there's a benefit to stating the expectations up front, to talk about this is what we expect on this relational front, about how we'll conduct ourselves, about how we won't hold each other up, how we're both trying to create value, about creating formal mechanisms for communication between the parties to find problems before they happen, to solve problems jointly, and so forth. And the formal part also refers to the fact that the lawyers who wrote this document think that there are legal remedies if somebody doesn't do that. So we talked about the defense contractor giving best efforts. Well, you would write, this is what best efforts mean in this contract, and they're arguing that it's actionable if they don't give their best efforts. So I'm a little bit skeptical. The notion that party A will meet with party B to build trust at 9 a.m. every Tuesday seems a bit artificial to me. What if party B doesn't show up? What if they show up and meet for 5 minutes to discuss the relationship? We've already talked about the costs of using the court system to resolve those issues. So those costs don't go away. So you may have heard of the term good faith actor. So what we're really trying to do is, identify or build or create a good faith actor that's going to work to the letter and the spirit of the agreement, most importantly, in order to create value for all parties. So, we're looking to find them historically in the traditional sense. You're looking to find people who have those good faith characteristics. This seems to suggest that by writing it down in a contract, you may be able to create good faith actors, that, if you put people on notice that these are the expectations and develop these mechanisms, that somehow people will learn to do the right thing.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, Back to our interview.
Well, they do go a little higher than that, even, Steve. They talk about a vested interest in each other's success and using a contract to create that, a shared vision, and they talk about guiding principles, which seems a bit imprecise. But then to your point, with robust governance structures to keep everything aligned, that the trust versus control issue seems to be not well articulated.
Yeah, I mean, this is the nub of the problem of, there are certain behaviors that good faith actors demonstrate, which is to grow the size of the pie rather than fighting over how the pie is going to be divided and so forth. And we know from negotiation theory, we know from game theory and so forth, if you're familiar with the tit for tat type game theory, that that there are superior equilibrium points. If you can get people to cooperate and find and teach people how to cooperate, you can actually create more value rather than having people defect all the time and going to these low equilibrium situations. So that's the challenge they're setting themselves. And can we get this higher level equilibrium point by getting people to cooperate rather than compete? And so they're arguing that by having the values articulated, by having the governance mechanisms, by having the values, the vision and so forth, that it's all laid out there for people to see, that is going to move people more towards a cooperative mindset.
So when you come out on the old versus new question, Steve, is we've talked about this new idea of the relational contract. For our entrepreneurs and business people who are listening, should they be thinking that contracting is changing, that there's evolution here, that they should think about contracting in this new and different way, changing their behavior in any fashion? What's your advice to practical listeners?
So my advice whenever somebody has got an out-of-the-box idea is, go for it, try it out, see if it works. Naturally, we're going to be skeptical because if that was the solution, surely somebody would have stumbled upon it 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But maybe the time is right and people are open to this idea and they can put these mechanisms in place that do have a positive effect. So the first advice is I wouldn't, want to pour cold water on the whole notion. Explore it, evolve it, find out what works and what doesn't work, and keep striving towards that outcome. Because if you can evolve cooperation, as Axelrod famously talked about in his evolution of cooperation work, you are going to create value for both parties. So there is value there to be captured, created, and then captured. So what you're really looking for, though, is good faith actors, people that are going to be cooperative, who are going to work towards creating a bigger pie for everybody to share. The big problem, of course, is it's very, very difficult to detect that in advance. So if I ask someone, are you a bad faith actor? As I'm about to enter into a contract with them, they're going to say no, right? Mm-hmm. It's like asking someone, are you a liar? The liar's going to say, no, I'm not, right? And so the answer is always no. So, writing a charter that outlines what it means to be a good faith actor might help set expectations, right, to a small degree. But as I've already mentioned, I question how effective the remedies would be in court or in another setting. I mean, you can imagine a defense contractor arguing about what best efforts meant and how they really honestly believed that the 3-inch screw was their best effort, and they're shocked to realize that wasn't going to get the job done. And, surely you can't punish us for that. So these things are just not, particularly as you pointed out, as the fuzzier they become, the more qualitative they become, the harder it is to argue in court that somebody's not fulfilling their end of the deal. So I still think that reputation is very important, and the best thing you can do is to build your reputation as a good faith actor and to seek out other people who have a similar reputation. I usually advise people, run little experiments with people. Do they do what they say they're going to do, or do they try and do something different? And if somebody doesn't do what they say they're going to do, run. If somebody is doing what they're doing, saying what they're going to do, then up the ante and give a little bit more and see how they handle that. So, as we've pointed out, there's no doubt that having more trust lowers transaction costs. And so Stephen Covey Jr., the son of the famous Stephen Covey, who had the Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about the speed of trust being vital for effective leadership. So the speed with which you can build trust in an organization and get people cooperating rather than competing is a competitive edge. So the same can be said of all stakeholder relationships, right? If I trust somebody and they make a mistake, then I'm more likely to see it as an innocent mistake rather than one with some sort of ill intent. And I'm more likely to make more effort with that person if I trust them.
Yeah, we had a discussion just a few episodes ago with Bill Sanders, who wrote a book called Creative Conflict. And he said one approach to this kind of relational contract, he didn't use that term, but I think it fits, is to come at it through the Austrian window of value and begin the contract discussion as what's the most value we could both get out of this before you negotiate, who captures which part of the value. So if you use the example from the article of Dell and FedEx, which they use as an example of the transition, Dell and FedEx could work together to find out ways to lower costs for both sides without specifying that in advance, but we'll both try and do that. And that means there's more value in the contract for both of us, and we both win. So what do you think of that, approaching this issue from a value proposition standpoint?
No, I mean, I think it's basically what I'm saying about the benefits of cooperation means higher value. So when I say a higher equilibrium point, it's creating more value to be divided between the parties. So if you can get that trust, if you can get that level of cooperation, that strong relationship, then you're going to potentially create more value, right? There's still the issue of the performance risks. I might have a great relationship with you, but you just can't do the job. But assuming when you're dealing with Fortune 500 companies that they have the capacity or they can buy the capacity, then really it's, do I trust them? And they're going to hold up their end of the bargain? So I think talking, a lot about how you can create more value by acting cooperatively than competitively is a good discussion to have. And there's been a term in the strategy literature called co-opetition, talking about that tension between the benefits of cooperating with a network of partners to try and become more competitive. So I think the idea is out there that, it's not all about cutthroat competition and that there can be benefits if we work together. But the devil's in the detail, right? About, why is this person willing to work with me and that person isn't? And there's plenty of examples where it just takes one change in personnel. The CEO changes, the chief marketing officer changes, and then they come in with a competitive philosophy instead of a cooperative one. And these relationships go out the window. So, it's a tough thing for organizations to keep that going and to develop that mindset, I think, is really the key to say, hey, we're going to have this cooperative mindset. But of course, you're exposing yourself to being taken advantage of by unscrupulous parties as well. So you've got to be very careful. You don't want to be signing billion-dollar deals with people that aren't going to keep up their end of the bargain. So I think it's an essential tension in business that has to be resolved.
So another concept that I've seen in the literature, Steve, is this idea of a psychological contract that goes beyond the formal contract. It's not written down. But one or both of the parties believes there's an obligation owed to them beyond the contract. The example that's used is a employment contract. So you sign an employment contract with an employer, you get your wages, you get your benefits, you get your working conditions. But the employee might perceive, hey, they're offering me a career here. I expect a career. I expect promotions. I expect learnings. I expect experiences when I go to conferences and things like that. And that psychological contract can be quite intense. It may also not be well understood or equally understood by both sides. And then all of a sudden you find your employee is disappointed because you haven't lived up to the psychological side of the contract. But is that valid? Is that a real thing that we should be thinking about?
Well, there's been a lot of research on this notion of psychological contracts, and I think the consensus in the management literature is that this is a real thing, and there are there are elements to the work relationship that are outside the formal contract. We all know there's give and take in the workplace, and there's more give and take in some workplaces than others. And, a friend of mine comes into work every day half an hour early. Every day. The contract says you should be here from 8 to 5, but she comes in from 7:30 to 5. But doing that also creates an expectation that if she has to take off time to go do something early or something like that, that management will be understanding and say, you've done this, for the last 5 years, and if, hey, you need to take the afternoon off to go and get your car serviced, then that's fine by us, Now, if they were to turn around and say, no, you can't leave, the contract says you've got to be here to 5, then we'd have a situation where there's a breach of psychological contract. I was giving something to the organization here, going above and beyond, but you're not giving me anything back as a result of that. So in some ways, it's that hold-up situation again, right? You're taking, but you're not honoring this sort of unwritten contract that we have. Now, I may never have mentioned that to you, but there's like an expectation that, hey, I'm doing this, so, there needs to be something, a little bit more flexibility on your behalf. And so, that's where you can get into trouble. Now, does it help to write all these little things down? I don't think it's possible, right? All these little quid pro quos and subjective arrangements that you have in the workplace. I mean, everyone who's listening to this can think of a million examples where there's some area of discretion, right, in how you do things. And that occur, if you're the owner, the founder, even if you're the CEO or manager, you learn to deal with those things, and you can have serious consequences if you breach those inadvertently or even consciously.
Right, which includes having a lot of empathy with the employee or the other party in those situations where it's not written down, it's not formal, so I've got to understand it. I've got to see things through their mental model in order to understand the intensity of their feelings.
Right, exactly. And so, and as you point out, there are other parties to these sort of informal contracts. So it's not just employees, it's going to be customers. And so you talk about the brand promise that their customer builds up in their mind about what they expect of you in terms of winning their business and so forth. And there may be overt promises made, but there may be these sort of subtle promises that are part of the expectations that you have to pay attention to. And of course, it extends to all sorts of stakeholders, the community, the distributors, the suppliers, and so forth. So there can be a lot of unwritten expectations, I guess.
Yeah, and well, thank you for introducing that concept, because I'd encourage our entrepreneurs to think about that. Your brand is a promise, and therefore it's a psychological contract. So you've got to think through then, what kinds of commitments do my consumers or customers think I am making? Do I understand what they think I'm committing to? And am I keeping up with that? And then every time I breach it, how does that feel to the customer? That's a psychological contract, I think, a brand.
Right, absolutely.
One of the quantifications of that we're looking at is the idea of how much work the customer has to do. And you mentioned getting your car serviced. One of the examples I read about was if I, as a consumer, commit to get up early and take my car to the dealership at 7:00 to get it serviced and make arrangements to be ready at 5 p.m. to come back to collect it, and then it's not ready, that's a huge psychological contract breach, and that could be terminally damaging to a relationship. So that's the kind of way that brands and services need to think.
Right, absolutely. And, I don't think customers particularly like those little asterisks at the bottom of the fine print there that say we reserve the right not to deliver at the stated time due to unforeseen circumstances when you've gone above and beyond. So, yeah, it's absolutely an issue. And I think there's an author from the 1960s called Blau who talks about the need to balance inducements with contributions, which is economic talk. We think about costs and benefits. So if you're asking the customer to contribute more to a sale, and both in terms of their time or their money, that means you've got to provide more benefits as a sort of compensation. So there's like a mental balancing that's going on with the customer. You're asking me to do this extra stuff. you should be providing a lot of extra value in that sense. So, I think it's important.
And then, so when you breach that value contract, it's been suggested that overcompensation is the right response on the supplier side. Do you agree with that? Can you overcompensate and get the trust back, do you think?
So Covey, the younger that we talked about earlier in his book, The Speed of Trust, argues that trust can be rekindled, but you really have to start walking the talk and acting with integrity and doing and saying doing what you say you're going to do. And so I think that's the essence. When I was talking earlier about how do you build a relationship and test people, you're looking for those results that people are going to be good faith actors and stand by their word, right? And so if I say it's going to be ready at 5 o'clock, and it's not, then I'm not showing integrity. So the way you rebuild that is that you have to, as you said, go over and above to make sure that every other experience after that exceeds expectations to sort of balance that bad experience.
So in the past, Steve, you've talked to us about dancing landscapes, about the challenges of finding the local peak and the global peak, and the landscape is moving all the time and everybody else is moving around, and it's really, really hard to figure out where you are. So one way to kind of sum up what we've talked about today is the world of contracting a dancing landscape? Is it a place for innovation? Is it a place where our entrepreneurial listeners should be thinking about new ways of doing things and keeping an eye out for new developments? Is it a dancing landscape?
I think it is. I think there's always evolution that's going on in every form of business relationship and arrangement, and that there are constant experiments going on with how to do things differently. Maybe we can drop this clause, maybe we can add that clause, maybe we can just rip up the traditional contract and start again with a relational contract. So I said I'm skeptical that big changes are going to, change the world overnight, but it happens. There's a probability, that somebody does come up with the next great innovation, but also there are going to be a lot of failures along the way. We understand that. It's the same with biological evolution. You do get new species and evolution towards higher peaks, to use that fitness landscape idea, but there are a lot of moves that are suboptimal in a way. So I'm always a little skeptical about new ideas, but I also celebrate successes when they happen and people that make it work. So what you're trying to do here is create this good faith actor. So how do you get someone who's going to honor their word, that's going to focus on value? And when I first came out of college, one of my first jobs was to be a total quality management coordinator, believe it or not, and
TQM.
TQM and Deming and so forth. And one of the promises of TQM was that, we weren't going to fire people. We were going to do process improvement, and everyone in the company has to fix problems and mistakes and errors, and it's everyone's job. And part of the mantra of that was that you don't punish people and you don't fire them and so forth. So Deming was very careful about creating this cooperative environment. And that's really what they're trying to do with this formal relational contract. How do we get people to work together rather than work in fear of that the other party is somehow going to do them harm? And if you know the history of what happened with TQM, it was replaced by business process reengineering because managers weren't happy with workers working on improving all sorts of processes. They wanted to choose which processes, and they wanted to be able to downsize. And right size became a new word and so forth. So if you think about it, that's a breach of the contract. You basically told people, hey, everyone gets to work on this stuff, and then you change the contract and say, well, hang on, we don't really mean that. We don't really mean you're not going to lose your job and so forth. So this is an example of how dynamic this can be, that, even if you buy into the notion that we have a cooperative system, there's no guarantee that someone else isn't going to come along and say, well, I don't agree with this and I'm going to change things. So,
yeah. So as always, it's not just a new device like a relational contract. It's also attitudes and people and the subjectivity of who's involved. So maybe we need new managers and new lawyers as well.
Well, I'll leave it at that point. No comment.
Very smart.
Everything is an opportunity. Every problem presents an opportunity. So I just applaud the authors for recognizing that there's an opportunity here.
As always. Good. Well, Stephen, thank you very much. You've advanced our understanding in another direction in trust and contracting and relationships, and we thank you and we appreciate your expertise. Thank you very much.
No problem. Glad I could be of assistance.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.